Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us today.
So it seems hard to believe that summer is already winding down, but now that we've turned our calendars to September, it's already time to start thinking about harvest. There's always a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that we're prepared for harvest and it's going to go as smoothly as possible. But we want to make sure that you don't overlook your ag technology while you're getting the rest of your equipment ready. We know that the data you're collecting on your farm during harvest is going to be useful in the future for decision making. So it's very important to make sure that we're setting ourselves up for success. So joining us today, we have Dr. John Fulton, a professor in the Department of Food, Agricultural, and Biological Engineering, and he is going to discuss preparing for harvest. Welcome, John. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth and Amanda, for having me here today. As you mentioned, I'm a professor and a state extension specialist in the Food, Ag, and Biological Engineering Department. And really my background, both from research and extension, is machinery automation, precision agriculture, and as you know now, we a lot of work in the digital ag space.
Awesome, John. Let's start off by talking about yield data collection. So it's been nearly a year since we used our yield monitors. What are the considerations we should make to get started as we prepare for harvest season?
When we think about yield monitors and in particular the data they collect, Amanda, the first step that we always like to recommend is making sure that the data on the display has already been archived or backed up. And to ensure that we don't lose any data, especially that from a prior harvest. So if wheat was the last crop harvested, make sure that you back everything up. And I encourage, if that's on a like a thumb drive or a compact flash or whatever the monitor uses, to get that transferred over to a laptop or some kind of storage space that where that can be securely and safely stored. Second, and important today here as we go into fall harvest is if you're using some kind of correction service for your GPS, make sure that you're paid up on that and to cover the harvesting season, but check with your provider to ensure that you've already got that paid for. You hate to either start or during harvest find out that you got to re-up on your correction service. And a really an important step is making sure your yield monitor and your GPS or GNSS receiver and possibly any sensors related to the yield monitor are up to date. So any firmware updates that companies have been put out, I'd recommend, whether it's yourself or getting with a dealer and making sure they check and ensure everything's up to date.
That's great advice. We know that the machine and the way that it's running is going to have an impact on that yield data that we collect. So what other settings or components do you recommend we take a look at before we get started?
Yeah, and that's a great point. I mean, if the harvester or combine in this example is not functioning properly, it's hard to believe that we're going to get good data out of it from a yield perspective. So, besides the normals, a lot of things from bearings, belts, and bushings to check. I recommend not only going through your corn head, but spending a lot of time on those platform headers today. They're pretty advanced, but going through and making sure the knives to all things on those headers are in peak performance and swap out anything that is either damaged or in poor operating condition. The other things is just go through and check all your augers and threshing mechanisms. Those are very important, especially the augers. They can tend to get wore within a season or even a full season, and working down the flighting on that kind of causes and minimizes efficiencies on getting grain conveyed within the combine. The really important one as it relates to yield monitor is really checking that clean grain elevator chain and paddles. making sure there's no damage, making sure it's got the right tension on it. That's very important, but making sure the clean grain elevator, including the bearings at the top and bottom, are in good operating shape, because ultimately we want that to be tensioned right, because it's carrying the clean grain up that elevator and ultimately accelerates that to be impacted by the impact plate.
Yeah, you mentioned how important that clean grain elevator is. And that kind of leads into the next thing. When we talk about collecting quality yield data, it's impossible to avoid talking about calibration. So to start off with, can you kind of explain, why calibration is so important, and really the role that some of these components are going to play in the calibration of your machine?
Yeah, the calibration. So when we talk about calibration, we're talking about calibrating the temperature mechanism in a grain moisture sensor. That's very important. The moisture sensor itself requires a check on it. Most importantly, though, to your question, Elizabeth, is calibrating what we call a mass flow sensor. A majority of the combines out there are going to have a mass flow sensor, and that sensor, the response to that sensor is not linear in nature. Okay, and what that means is whether from low flow up to a very high flow, okay, or very low yield to a very high yield. That is not linear in nature. And so in order to properly calibrate that, we need to operate the combine in low flow conditions. We'll say 8 to 10 bushels a second roughly, all the way up to a high flow condition. And normally we do that at 4 different points. Sometimes we can get 5, but 4 is recommended for most of these yield monitors. But the point in that is to make sure that from low flow to the medium flow to the high flow, we map out the response of that sensor in order for it to estimate as accurate as possible the yield estimate or the mass flow estimate actually for that sensor.
Calibration is going to be really important this fall. We just talked about all the steps they can take, but some of the fields that I've been in, just going 100 yards up the field, I've got ears that are going to yield 200 bushel and then ears that are going to yield less than 80. So how does that play into calibration and making sure it's accurate?
Yeah, and I think for some parts of Ohio, that's how it's going to be, Amanda. We're going to have fields, like you say, range from 50 to 200 plus bushel on corn. And I've seen beans, they'll be lucky to be in that 20, 25 bushel all the way to probably to 80 bushel. And so when we look at that large range of yield within a field, calibration is going to be very important in order to have good estimates out of these yield monitors. So doing that 4-point calibration procedure that's recommended for most of the monitors out there, double checking your calibration in kind of low yielding areas and high yielding areas will be important, because we just don't want that yield monitor to be operating accurately kind of at the middle and the high. We want to also be able to document those low areas, so we when we do kind of a post harvest, or if we're watching the monitor during harvest, we're trying to compare apples to apples and understanding what the actual yield differences are within the field.
Yeah, so one of the other challenges we're going to have with the variability we're seeing out there is deciding when we should recalibrate the machine throughout the season. What recommendations do you have for our listeners when we talk about needing to recalibrate to stay within an accurate range throughout the whole harvest season?
Right off, and I know we've already got a few folks that I've talked to gearing up for corn harvest, and that's going to be high moisture corn, Elizabeth. It's already in a couple cases down to about 28%. They're going to wait a few days, if not early next week, and get started. So that's going to be higher moisture corn, and so I always recommend having a calibration for high moisture corn, and then calibration for corn that's under 20%. So right away, that's a differential from a calibration. You're going to anything over 20%, you need to have a calibration curve built for that combine, and then anything under 20% moisture corn, have a second calibration to make sure that you when you're entering the field and you say, hey, it's going to be a low moisture or below 20%, I'm using that calibration versus a high. Soybeans, normally speaking, we do not need a high versus low just because of the, we're not in that large moisture fluctuation. In corn, we could be anywhere from 13 to, 28, almost 30%. But for soybeans, typically we're in the, 11 to 18%. And we don't, one calibration curve should work for it.
So maybe straying a little bit from talking about the yield monitor itself, another challenge we're going to face is harvest loss with these variable conditions. How would someone go about keeping an eye on harvest loss, and what adjustments would you recommend they make?
Yeah. First, the newer combines out there. So if it's a newly purchased or leased combine, a lot of them have a pretty solid technology to monitor harvest loss and give that kind of feedback. Not only harvest loss, but grain quality. And so the newer machines give that indication right in the cab, and in some cases will actually adjust on the go for the operator. For those that don't have maybe some of the newer harvest loss and quality, stopping that machine, doing a hard stop. Normally what we do is we get out and we look right behind the header to look at, are we getting hard losses from the header? That's in particular, that's very important for soybeans, where we get shattering that could be occurring. Typically in corn, we can see if ears are popping out over top of the header very easily from the cab. But we want to pay attention to not only header loss, but more importantly, what's coming out the back, Elizabeth. But stopping, getting out, taking an area, counting the number of grain on the ground in that area. Most manufacturers have all that information in the operator's manual. But taking a look at that, another way to look at grain loss, and I like to do it, is the guy that's running a grain cart or someone at the end, maybe driving trucks, going out and occasionally checking, again, seeing what kind of harvest loss might be out there. And that's very important. Most of the time we can be down 1.5 bushel loss on these newer combines. But if you're running 2, 3, 4 bushel loss, you definitely need to make some adjustments on your machine to eliminate that.
So another important tool that we have is what we have in the tractor cab. And whether that's making sure you have the storage available. You mentioned making sure your subscriptions are in place. So what are important pieces of information that we want to collect during harvest from the cab?
Well, I think of all things, for me, Amanda, making observations and notes during harvest is as important as any other data piece we collect. Most of the farmers today seem to be using a lot of the planter technology that's able to capture not only the rate, but a lot of information about the planting operation. And within those apps and platforms have remote sense imagery. For me, we look at a lot of, I suggest, especially if the imagery is available, to look at imagery before you go to the field and think about some areas that you want to really pay attention to. Some of those may have been scouted earlier in the season, but as we sit in these cabs of these combines, I think trying to figure out what some of the yield limitations were for that year are very important. And I mean that as we move through the field. I think collecting data, if that's possible, making observations, and so noting, we'd love to see that 300 bushel coming through that combine in all areas of field, but the reality of the growing season here, the shears, that's not going to happen. It's going to be very spotty. And so what happened in those lower area, lower yielding areas from 80 to 100 to 150 bushel. What are what was the real limiting factor variable this year? Was it just water? We had a lot of instances of compaction causing nutrient deficiencies. I know there was several fields that I went in and saw where Pentro or rows adjacent to equipment passes had potassium deficiencies. Again, that was due to compaction. Some of that's hard to see at harvest, but the point in that is can we visualize, and as we replay the growing season, take the opportunity on a field by field, subfield basis, and understand why we saw, when we get that yield map completed, why some of those areas were lower yielding, below average, typically, and understanding that so we can learn from that and think about what we could do, if possible, to improve that in the future.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important. A yield map without that extra information you have to help interpret what you're seeing on those maps, they're not as useful as they potentially could be. Do you have any comments you want to share on, taking this data that we're collecting and using it in the farm operation?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of apps out there, and companies are building some. So I'll name a couple, but that doesn't mean that there's not others. We've been very successful, with using Climate Field View cab as a means to take notes. It's nice to have in the cab of the harvester because you can see the planted data, that imagery, and you can drop pins very easily as you're harvesting and type in notes and even take pictures while you're out there harvesting. Of course, our OSU plots, we use that too to, again, take notes and pictures and have that georeference back to points in the field. And so those are really handy to have and keeps all your information in an electronic format. And for us, that makes it fairly easily shareable with others in the team too, as we learn things or need to share information for those working in that field. So I think anytime you can capture any of that and have that, Elizabeth and Amanda, we harvest today, we make some observations, but geez, we're going to go through another 20 plus fields. We forget a lot of those observations possibly. We'll remember some of the real important ones, but having some of those observations and being able to share that with others within the operation is very important as you think about and plan ahead for next season.
Yeah, and just want to clarify that you were referring to the smartphone app when you mentioned OSU Plots, in case people haven't used that before. It's available on Android and Apple, correct?
Yep, that's correct.
So that's just one of the tools that we have available. John, what other resources do we have through the Digital Ag program that you would recommend folks check out?
Well, number one is the eFields report that comes out annually, and that's published first, second week of January each year. There's an online version plus a hard copy version that we publish, and so that's a great resource that kind of culminates a lot of the work and demonstrations that are done here within the College of Ag at Ohio State, and so that's a really strong resource from a production perspective. And also, we have a digital ag web page along that complements what the agronomy team does as well on their web page. So all those are excellent resources to use, and most of all that is online and very readily accessible for folks.
Well, thanks so much for your time. A lot of valuable information, and data is power, and the more information that we're able to collect, the more we're able to improve our operations. So these tools that we have now, I think, are really critical, and it's important to, learn more and make sure they're working correctly and that we're utilizing them to the best of our abilities.
Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity, and we want to wish everyone the best of luck here for the fall harvest.
Thanks for listening to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Join us again in 2 weeks for our next episode.